2026 and tomorrow it would be 26 January 2026. Okay. So we are going to discuss about our constitution, the philosophy of the constitution. Now here we are going to discuss about the first of all introduction. In this book so far as we have studied some important provisions of our constitution and the way in which these have worked in the last 69 years, and we also studied the way in which the constitution was made. But have you ever asked yourself why leaders of the national movement felt the need to adopt our constitutions after achieving independence from British rule? Why did they choose to bind themselves and the future generations to a constitution? In this book, you have repeatedly visited the debates in the Constituent Assembly, but it should be asked why the study of the Constitution must be accompanied by a deep examination of the debates in the Constituent Assembly. This question will be addressed in this chapter. Secondly, it is important to ask what kind of a constitution we have given ourselves. What objectives did we hope to achieve by it? Do these objectives have a moral contents? If so, what precisely is it? When are the strengths and limitations of this vision, and by implications, the achievements and weaknesses of the Constitution? In doing so, we try to understand what can we call the philosophy of the Constitution. After reading this chapter, you should be able to understand why it is important to study the philosophy of the Constitution, what are the core features of the Indian Constitution, what are the criticisms of this Constitution, and what are the limitations of the Constitution. Now, let's discuss about what is meant by the philosophy of the Constitution. Some people believe that a constitution merely consists of laws and that laws are one thing, values and morality quite another. Therefore, we can have only a legislative, not a political philosophy approach to the constitution. It is true that all the laws do not have a moral content, but many laws are closely connected to our deeply held values. For example, a law might prohibit discrimination of persons on the grounds of language or religion. Such a law is connected to the idea of equality. Such a law exists because we value equality. Therefore, there is a connection between the laws and moral values. We must therefore look upon the constitution as a document that is based on a certain moral vision. We need to adopt a political philosophy approach to the constitution. What do we mean by the political philosophy approach to the constitution? We have three things in the mind. First, we need to understand the conceptual structure of the constitution. What does this mean? It means that we must ask the questions like what are the possible meaning of the terms used in the constitution, such as right, citizenship, minority, or democracy. Furthermore, we must attempt to work out a coherent vision of the society and political conditional upon an interpretation of the key concepts of the constitution. We must have better grasp of the set of ideals embedded in the constitution. Our final point is that the Indian constitution must be read in the conjunction with the Constitutional Assembly debates in order to refine and raise to a higher theoretical plane, and the justification of values embedded in the Constitution. A philosophical treatment of a value is incomplete if a detailed justification for it is not provided. When the framers of the constitution chose to guide Indian society and polity by a set of values, there must have been a corresponding set of reasons. Many of them, though, may not have been fully explained. Here, does it mean that all the constitutions have a philosophy, or is it that only some constitutions have a philosophy? उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है इधर? The Japanese Constitution of 1947 is popularly known as the Peace Constitution, and the preamble states that we, the Japanese people, desire peace for all the time and are deeply conscious of the high ideals controlling human relationships. And the philosophy of the Japanese Constitution is thus based on the ideal of peace. Article number 9 of the Japanese Constitution states, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on the justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of the force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces as well as other potential will never be maintained. And this shows how the context of the making the constitution dominates the thinking of the constitution makers. Now, a political philosophy approach to the constitution is needed not only to find out the moral content expressed in it and to evaluate its claims, but possibly to use it to arbitrate between the varying interpretations of the many core values in our polity. It is obvious that many of the ideals are challenged, discussed, debates, and contested in the different political arenas, in the legislatures, इन द पार्टी फॉर्म्स इन द प्रेस. कोई था नहीं ना, तो इसलिए मैं स्पीड में बोल रही थी. इन स्कूल्स एंड यूनिवर्सिटीज दीज आइडियल्स आर वेरियसली इंटरप्रेटेड एंड समटाइम्स willfully manipulated to suit the partisan short-term interests. We must therefore examine whether or not a serious disjunction exists between the constitutional ideal and its expression in other arenas. Sometimes the same ideal is interpreted differently by different institutions. We need to compare. I am studying the philosophy of the constitution because tomorrow is Republic Day. Yes, of course, I do remember this issue of different interpretations of the constitution. We discussed it in the last chapter, didn't we? Sometimes the same ideal is interpreted differently by different institutions. We need to compare these differing interpretations since the expression of the ideal in the constitution has considerable authority. It must be used to arbitrate in conflict of the interpretations over values or ideals. Our constitution can perform this job of arbitration. Now, constitution as a means of democratic transformation. In the first chapter, we have studied the meaning of the term constitution and the need to have constitution. It is widely agreed that one reason for having constitutions is the need to restrict the exercise of power. Modern states are excessively powerful. They are believed to have a monopoly over the forced and coercion. What if institutions of such states fall into wrong hands who abuse this power? Even if these institutions were created for our safety and well-being, they can easily turn against us. Experience of state power the world over shows that most states are prone to harming the interests of at least some individuals and groups. If so, we need to draw the rules of the game in such a way that this tendency of states is continuously checked. Constitutions provide these basic rules and therefore prevent states from turning tyrannical. Constitution also provide peaceful democratic means to bring about social transformation. Moreover, for hitherto colonized people, constitutions announce and embody the first real exercise of political self-determination. Nehru understood both these points as well. The demand for a constituent assembly, he claimed, represented a collective demand for full self-determination because only a constituent assembly of elected representatives of the Indian people had the right to frame the India's constitution without external interference. Second, he argued the constituent assembly is not just a body of people or a gathering of able lawyers. Rather, it is nation on the move, throwing away the shell of its past political and possibly social structure and fashioning for itself a new garment of its own making. And the Indian constitution was designed to break the shackles of traditional social hierarchies and to usher in a new era of freedom, equality and justice. Here, so can we say that members of the Constituent Assembly were all eager to bring social transformations, but we also keep saying that all give points were represented in the assembly. Now here, this approach had the potential of changing the theory of the constitutional democracy altogether. According to this approach, constitutions exist not only to limit the people in the power, but to empower those who traditionally have been deprived of it. And constitutions can give vulnerable people the power to achieve collective good. Why do we need to go back the Constituent Assembly? Why look backwards and bind ourselves to the past? That may be the job of a legal historian, to go into the past and search for the basis of a legal and political ideas. But why should students of politics be interested in studying the intentions and concerns of those who framed the constitution? Why not take account of changed circumstances and define anew the normative function of the constitution? In the context of America, where the constitution was written in the late 18th century, it is absurd to apply the values and standards of that era in the 21st century. However, in India, the world of the original framers and our present day world may not have changed so drastically. In terms of our values, ideals and conception, we have not separated ourselves from the world of the Constituent Assembly. A history of our constitution is still very much a history of the present. Now here is activity. Read again the quotas from the debates of the Constituent Assembly given in the following chapters. Do you think that the arguments in those quotations have relevance for our present times? Why? Quotes in chapter 2, quotes in chapter 7. Furthermore, we have forgotten the real point underlying several of our legal and political practices simply because somewhere down the road we begin to take them for granted. These reasons have now slipped into the background, screened off from our consciousness, even though they still provide the organizational principle to current practices. When the going is good, this forgetting is harmless, but when these practices are challenged or threatened, neglect of the underlying principles can be harmful. In short, to get a handle on current constitutional practice, to grasp their value and meaning, we may have no option but to go back in time to the Constituent Assembly debates and perhaps even further back in time of the colonial era. Therefore, we need to remember and keep revisiting the political philosophy underlying our constitution. This is tough. Why couldn't This is tough. Why could not they plainly tell us how the philosophy of the constitution is? How can ordinary citizen understand the philosophy of its hidden like this? If it is hidden like this, here what is the political philosophy of our constitution? It is hard. Thank you. Good morning. What is the political philosophy of our constitution? It is hard to describe this philosophy in one word. It resists any single label because it is liberal, democratic, egalitarian, secular, and federal, open to community values, sensitive to the needs of the religious and linguistic minorities as well as historical disadvantaged groups, and committed to the building a common national identity. Here, while all ideas unfold on the playfield, democracy is the umpire. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है? In short, it is committed to the freedom, equality, social justice, and some form of national unity. But underneath all this, there is a clear emphasis on the peaceful and democratic measures for putting this philosophy into the practice. Now, in Indian Constitution, individual freedom is concerned. The first point to note about the Constitution is its commitment to individual freedom. This commitment did not emerge miraculously out of calm deliberations around a table. Rather, it was the product of continuous intellectual and political activity of well over a century. As early as the beginning of the 19th century, Ram Mohan Roy protested against curtailment of the freedom of the press by the British colonial state. Roy argued that a state responsive to the needs of the individual must provide them the means by which their needs are communicated. Therefore, the state must, matlab country must permit unlimited liberty of publication. Likewise, Indians continued to demand a free press throughout the British rule. It is not surprising, therefore, the freedom of expression is an integral part of the Indian Constitution. Freedom of expression. So is the freedom from arbitrary arrest. After all, the infamous Rowlatt Act, which the national movement opposed so vehemently, sought to deny this basic freedom. And this and the other individuals' freedoms, such as freedom of conscience, are the part of the liberal ideology. On the basis, we can say that Indian Constitution has a pretty strong liberal character. In the chapter on the fundamental rights, we have already seen how the Constitution values individual freedom. It might be recalled that for over 40 years before the adoption of the Constitution, every single resolution, scheme, bill, and report of the Indian National Congress mentioned individual rights not just in passing but as a non-negotiable value. Now let's talk about the social justice. When we say that the Indian Constitution is liberal, we do not mean that it is liberal only in the classical Western sense. In this book on the political theory, you will learn more about the idea of liberalism. Classical liberalism always privileges rights of the individuals over the demands of social justice and community values. उसके बाद next जो है, now check your progress. State which of the following rights are part of the individual freedom. इनमें से कौन सा जो है आपका individual freedom का part है? Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights of minorities, equal access to the public places. उसके बाद the liberalism of the Indian Constitution differs from this version in two ways. First, it was always linked to the social justice. The best example of this is the provision for the reservation for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Constitution. And the makers of the Constitution believed that the mere granting of the right to equality was not enough to overcome age-old injustices suffered by these groups or to give real meaning to their rights to vote. Special constitutional measures were required to advance their interests. Therefore, the Constitution makers provided a number of special measures to protect the interests of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, such as the reservation of seats in the legislatures. The Constitution also made it possible for the government to reserve the public sector jobs for these groups. Indian liberalism has two streams. The first stream began with the Ram Mohan Roy. He emphasized individual rights, particularly the rights of women. The second stream included thinkers like K.C. Sen, Justice Ranade, and Swami Vivekanand. They introduced the spirit of social justice within Orthodox Hinduism. For Vivekanand, such a recording of Hindu society could not have been possible without liberal principles. ये K.M. Paniakkar ने बोला. In defense of liberalism, Bombay Asia Publishing House 1962. उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है वो क्या है इधर, आई हैव ऑलवेज वंडर्ड हु आई एम, आई हैव सो मेनी आइडेंटिटीज इन माई बैग, आई हैव माई रिलीजियस आइडेंटिटी, आई हैव माई लिंग्विस्टिक आइडेंटिटी, आई हैव टाइज विद माई पेरेंटल टाउन, एंड ऑफ कोर्स आई एम अ स्टूडेंट ऑल्सो. नाउ सी हियर, Respect for the diversity and minority. The Indian constitution encourages equal respect between the communities, and this was not easy in our country. First, because communities do not always have a relationship of equality. They tend to have hierarchical relationships with one another, as in the case of caste. Second, when these communities do see each other as equals, they also tend to become rivals, as in the case of religious communities. And this was huge challenge for the makers of the constitution, how to make communities liberal in their approach and foster a sense of equal respect among them under existing conditions of hierarchy or intense rivalry. It would have been very easy to resolve this problem by not recognizing communities at all, as most Western liberal constitutions do. But this would have been unworkable and undesirable in our country. This is not because Indians are attached to communities more than others. Individuals everywhere also belong to cultural communities, and every such community has its own values, traditions, customs, and languages shared by its members. For example, individuals in France or Germany belong to the linguistic community and are deeply attached to it. What makes us different is that we have more openly acknowledged the value of communities. More importantly, India is a land of multiple cultural communities. Unlike Germany or France, we have several linguistic and religious communities in India. It was important to ensure that no one community systematically dominates the others in India. This made it mandatory for our constitution to recognize the community based rights. इंडिया में क्या है, community based rights है, ठीक है. उसके बाद next जो है, one such right is the right of religious communities to establish and run their own educational institutions. Such institutions may receive money from the government, and this provision shows that the Indian constitution does not see the religion merely as a private matter concerning the individual. उसके बाद next है secularism. Secular states are widely seen as a treating religion as only a private matter. That is to say, they refuse to give the religion public or official recognition. Does this mean that the Indian constitution is not secular? This does not follow. Though the term secular was not initially mentioned, the Indian constitution has always been secular. The mainstream Western conception of secularism means mutual exclusion of state and religion in order to protect the values such as individual freedom and citizenship rights of the individuals. Again, this is something that you will learn more about in the political theory. The term mutual exclusion means this both religion and state must stay away from the internal affairs of one another, and the state must, matlab country must not intervene in the domain of religion. Religion likewise should not dictate state policy or influence the conduct of the state. In other words, mutual exclusion means that religion and state must be strictly separated. What is the purpose behind the strict separation? It is to safeguard the freedom of individuals. States which lend support to organized religions make them more powerful than they already are. When religious organizations begin to control the religious lives of the individuals, when they start dictating how they should relate to the God or how they should pray, individuals may have the option of turning to the modern state for protecting their religious freedoms. But what help would a state offer them if it has already joined hands with these organizations to protect the religious freedom of individuals? Therefore, state must not help the religious organizations, but at the same time, state should not tell religious organizations how to manage their affairs. That too can thwart religious freedom. The state must therefore not hinder religious organizations. Either in short, states should neither help nor hinder the religions. Instead, they should keep themselves at an arm's length from them. This has been the prevalent Western conception of the secularism. Conditions in India were different, and to respond to the challenge they posed, the makers of the constitution had to work out an alternative conception of secularism. They departed from the Western model in two ways and for two different reasons. एक तो rights of religious groups की वजह से. First, as mentioned already, they recognized that inter-community equality was as necessary as equality between the individuals. This was because a person's freedom and sense of self-respect was directly dependent upon the status of a community. If one community was dominated by the another, then its members would also be significantly less free. If on the other hand their relations were equal, marked by the absence of domination, then its members would also walk about with dignity, self-respect and freedom. Thus, the Indian constitution grants rights to all religious communities, such as the right to establish and maintain their educational institutions. Freedom of religions in India means the freedom of religion of both individuals and community. Now, state's power of intervention. Second, separation in India could not mean mutual exclusion. Why is it so? Because religiously sanctioned customs such as untouchability deprived individuals of the most basic dignity and self-respect. Such customs were so deeply rooted and pervasive that without active state intervention, ये है 11th क्लास की पॉलिटिकल साइंस द फिलोसफी ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. And without active state intervention, there was no hope of their dissolution. The state simply had to interfere in the in the affairs of religion. Such intervention was not always negative. The state could also help religious communities by giving aid, matlab help to educational institutions run by them. Thus, the state may help or hinder religious communities depending on which mode of action promotes values such as freedom and equality. In India, separation between the religion and state did not mean their mutual exclusion. बट अब भी मैं 10th की नहीं पढ़ा रही हूँ, 10th की भी मैं पढ़ाती हूँ. आई वुड लाइक टू नो वेदर फाइनली द स्टेट कैन रेगुलेट मैटर्स रिलेटेड टू द रिलीजन और नॉट, अदरवाइज देयर कैन बी नो रिलीजियस रिफॉर्म्स. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है, इन इंडिया सेपरेशन बिटवीन द रिलीजन एंड स्टेट डिड नॉट मीन देयर म्यूचुअल एक्सक्लूजन बट रादर प्रिंसिपल्ड डिस्टेंस, a rather complex idea that allows the state to be distant from all the religions so that it can intervene or abstain from the interference depending upon which of these two would better promote liberty, equality and social justice. We have hitherto mentioned three core features. These can also be seen as the achievements of our constitution. First, our constitution reinforces and reinvents forms of liberal individualism, and this is an important achievement because this is done in the backdrop of our society where community values are often indifferent or hostile to individual autonomy. Second, our constitution upholds the principle of social justice without compromising an individual. बस पढ़ने से आएगी, उसको पढ़ो, रीडिंग करो. सेकेंड, अवर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन रीडिंग अपहोल्ड्स द प्रिंसिपल ऑफ सोशल जस्टिस विदाउट कॉम्प्रोमाइजिंग ऑन इंडिविजुअल लिबर्टीज. द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल कमिटमेंट टू कास्ट बेस्ड अफर्मेटिव एक्शंस प्रोग्राम shows how much ahead like India was compared to the other nations. Can one forget that affirmative actions programs in the US were begun after the 1964 Civil Rights Acts, almost 2 decades after they were constitutionally entrenched in India? Third, against the background of the intercommunal strife, the Constitution upholds its commitment to group rights, the right to the expression of cultural particularity. This indicates that the framers of the Constitution were more than willing to face the challenges of what more than the 4 decades later has come to be known as multiculturalism. Universal franchise. Two other core features may also be recognized, regarded as achievements. First, it is no mean achievement to commit oneself to universal franchise, especially when there is widespread belief that the traditional hierarchies. मैं अब कोई सा कोर्स नहीं कर रही हूँ, मेरे को जो है नेट JRF क्वालिफाई करना है. I want to pursue PhD now, or I want to become an IAS officer now. Two other core features may also be regarded as achievements. First, it is no mean achievement to commit oneself to universal franchises, especially when there is widespread belief that traditional hierarchies in India are congealed and more or less impossible to eliminate, and when the rights to vote has only recently been extended to women and to the working class in the stable Western democracies. Once the idea of a nation took root among the elite, the idea of democratic self-government followed. Thus, Indian nationalism always conceived of a political order based on the will of every single member of society. The idea of universal franchise lay securely within the heart of nationalism. As early as the Constitution of India, Bill 1895, the first non-official attempt at drafting a constitution for India, the author declared that every citizen, that is anyone born in India, had a right to take part in the affairs of the country and be admitted to the public office. The Motilal Nehru Report 1928 wali reaffirms this conception of citizenship, reiterating that every person of either sex who has attained the age of 21 is entitled to vote for the House of the Representatives of the Parliament. Thus, from very early on, universal franchise was considered as the most important and legitimate instrument by which the will of the nation was to be properly expressed. The Assembly has adopted the principle of adult franchise with an abundant. 12th क्लास में मैंने 71.6% जो है वो स्कोर किया था. मेरे पास कंबाइंड स्ट्रीम थी, नॉन मेडिकल और मेडिकल. दैट्स वाई आई एम स्टडिंग दिस बुक ऑफ 11th क्लास नाउ डेज, बिकॉज मेरे को फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल तो UGC NET JRF क्वालिफाई करना है जून वाला, और UGC NET JRF क्वालिफाई करते ही एक सब्जेक्ट पे तो कमांड हो जाएगी मेरी, ऑप्शनल पॉलिटिकल साइंस पे, पॉलिटिकल साइंस एंड इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस पे, और GS 2 पे। फिर धीरे धीरे जो है मेरे को अपने यूपीएससी के सिलेबस पे कमांड बनानी है, और एनी हाउ मुझे जो है अपना यूपीएससी CSE क्लियर करना है, और मुझे IAS ऑफिसर बनना ही बनना है, ठीक है। तो एज ऑफ नाउ आई एम डूइंग सेल्फ स्टडी। मेरे को सेल्फ स्टडी कर करके जो है जितने भी मेरे गवर्नमेंट मतलब मेन जो टारगेट है वो है नेट JRF एंड UPSC। अभी तक मेरे को टाइम नहीं मिला था पढ़ने का, लेकिन अब जो है मैं धीरे धीरे जो है अपना सिलेबस पे कमांड बना रही हूँ। द असेंबली has adopted the principle of adult franchisee with an abundant faith in the common man and the ultimate success of the democratic rule, and in the full belief that the introduction of the democratic government on the basis of adult suffrage will promote the well-being. Alladi Krishna Swami Iyer, ये नवंबर 23 1949 की बातें हैं। ये बच्चा क्या सोच रहा है? इट इज़ सर्टेनली अ मैटर ऑफ प्राइड दैट द प्रिंसिपल ऑफ वन मैन वन वोट वॉज एक्सेप्टेड ऑलमोस्ट अनकंटेस्टेड। इजंट इट ट्रू दैट वीमेन हैड टू स्ट्रगल फॉर देयर राइट टू वोट इन मैनी अदर कंट्रीज, ठीक है। उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है क्या है? नेक्स्ट है फेडरलिज्म। Federalism, second, by introducing the article concerning Northeast, Article 371, the Indian Constitution anticipates the very important concept of asymmetric federalism. We have seen in the chapter on the federalism that the Constitution has created a strong central government, but despite this unitary bias of the Indian Constitution, there are important constitutionally embedded differences between the legal status and prerogatives of different subunits within the same federation. Unlike the Constitution symmetry of American federalism, Indian federalism has been constitutionally asymmetric. To meet the specific needs and requirements of some subunits, it was always part of the original design to have a unique relationship with them or to give them special status. Under Article 371 ka clause A, the principle of a special status was also accorded to the northeastern state of Nagaland, and this article not only confers validity or pre-existing laws within the Nagaland but also protects local identity through the restrictions on the immigration. Many other states too are beneficiaries of such special provisions. According to the Indian Constitution, then there is nothing bad about this differential treatment. Although the Constitution did not originally envisage that this India is now a multilingual federation. Each major linguistic group is politically recognized and all are treated as equals. Thus, the democratic and linguistic federalism of India has managed to combine claims to the unity with the claims to the cultural recognition. A fairly robust political arena exists that allows for the play of multiple identities that complement one another. इधर जो next है वो क्या है? I am really impressed who says our constitution is based on the imitation. In every borrowed aspect we have put our distinct imprint. उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? National identity. Thus the constitution constantly reinforces a common national identity. In the chapter on the federalism, you have studied how the India strives to retain regional identities along with the national identity. It is clear from what is mentioned above that this common national identity was not incompatible with distinct religious or linguistic identities, and the Indian Constitution tried to balance these various identities, yet preferences was given to common identity under certain conditions. This is clarified in the debate over separate electorates based on the religious identity which the Constitution rejects. Separate electorates were rejected, not because they fostered difference between the religious communities as such or because they endangered a simple notion of national unity, but because they endangered a healthy national life. Rather than forced unity, our constitution sought to evolve the true fraternity, a goal dear to the heart of Dr. Ambedkar. As Sardar Patel put it, the main objective was to evolve the one community. Here, Sardar Patel, ये 25/1949 को, but in the long run it would be in the interest of all to forget that there is anything like majority or minority in this chapter. ठीक है, मैंने ये नाम जो है लिख लिया है जो आपने बुक बोली है। बाकी मैंने इसका नाम जो है ज़िंदगी में पहली बार अभी तक सुना है। मैं सर्च करूँगी, मिल गई तो ठीक है, नहीं मिली तो भी ठीक है। यस, तो मैं कहाँ पहुँच गई थी? बट इन द लॉन्ग रन इट वुड बी इन द इंटरेस्ट ऑफ ऑल टू फॉरगेट दैट देर इज़ एनीथिंग लाइक अभी तो मेरा लेवल इतना लो है कि मेरे को एनसीईआरटी नहीं समझ में आ रही है। फर्स्टली तो जो है एक दो बार मेरे को यही पढ़ना पड़ेगा, देन आई विल सी कि मेरा लेवल कहाँ तक पहुँचता है। प्रीलिम्स में तो दो बार फेल हो ही गई हूँ, बट इन द लॉन्ग रन इट वुड बी इन द इंटरेस्ट ऑफ ऑल टू फॉरगेट दैट देर इज anything like majority or minority in this country, and that is that in the India there is only one community. Now here procedural achievement, all these five core features are what might be called the substantive achievements of the constitution. However, there were also some procedural achievements. First, the Indian constitution reflects a faith in the political deliberations. We know that many groups and interests were not adequately represented in the constituent assembly, but the debates in the constituent assembly imply show that the makers of the debates in the assembly imply show that the makers of the constitution wanted to be as inclusive in their approach as possible. This open-ended approach indicates the willingness of the people to modify their existing preferences, in short, to justify outcomes by reference not to self-interest but to reasons. It also shows a willingness to recognize creative value in difference and disagreement. Second, it reflects a spirit of compromise and accommodation. These words, compromise and accommodation, should not always be seen with disapproval. Not all compromises are bad. If something of value is traded off for mere self-interest, then we naturally have compromised in the bad sense. However, if one value is partially traded off for the another value, especially in an open process of free deliberation among the equals, then the compromise arrived in this manner can hardly be objected to. We may lament that we could not have everything, but to secure a bit of all things important cannot be morally blameworthy. Now, besides the commitment to the idea that decisions on the most important issues must be arrived at consensually rather than by majority vote is equally morally commendable. Here, यहाँ पे ये बच्चा क्या सोच रहा है? I understand compromises in the design of the institutions, but how can conflicting principles be accommodated? Now, criticisms. The Indian Constitution can be subjected to many criticisms, of which three may be briefly mentioned. First, that it is unwieldy. Second, that it is unrepresentative, and third, that is it is aligned to our conditions. The criticism that it is unwieldy is based on the assumption that the entire constitution of a country must be found in one compact document, but this is not true even of the countries such as the US, which do not have a compact constitution. The fact is that a country's constitution is to be identified within a compact document and with other written documents with the constitutional status. That is, thus it is possible to find the important constitutional statements and practices outside one compact document. In the case of India, many such details, practices and statements are included in one single document, and this has made that document somewhat large in the size. Many countries, for instance, do not have provisions for election commission or the civil service commission in the document known as the constitution. उसके बाद, but in India, many such matters are attended to by the constitutional document itself. A second criticism of the constitution is that it is unrepresentative. Do you remember how the Constituent Assembly was formed at that time? Adult franchise was not yet granted, and most members came from the advanced sections of the society. Does this make our constitution unrepresentative? Here we must distinguish two components of representation, one that might be called voice and the other opinion. ठीक है? Yes, my medium is English. The voice component of representation is important. People must be recognized in their own language or voice, not in the language of the masters. If we look at the Indian Constitution from this dimension, it is indeed unrepresentative because members of the Constituent Assembly were chosen by a restricted franchise, not by universal suffrage. However, if we examine the other dimension, we may not find it altogether lacking in representativeness. The claim that almost every shade of opinion was represented in the Constituent Assembly may be a trifle exaggerated, but may have something to it. If we read the debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly, we find that a vast range of issues and opinions were mentioned. Members raised matters not only based in their individual social concerns, but based on the perceived interests and concerns of various social sections as well. Here, of course, isn't it what we learnt in the first chapter, that there should be a valid reason for every section of society to go along with the constitutions. Here, it is a coincidence that the central square of every other small town has a statue of Dr. Ambedkar with a copy of the Indian Constitution constitution. Far from being a mere symbolic tribute to him, this expresses the feeling among the Dalits that the constitution reflects many of their aspirations. A final criticism alleges that the Indian constitution is entirely an aligned document, borrowed article by article from Western constitution and sits uneasily with the cultural ethos of the Indian people. This criticism is often voiced by many. Even in the Constituent Assembly itself, there were some voices that echo this concern. How far is this charge true? Is it true? It is true that the Indian constitution is modern and partly Western. Do you remember that in the first chapter we have listed the various sources from which our constitution borrowed? But in this chapter you have also seen that it was never a blind borrowing. It was innovative borrowing. Besides, as we shall see, this does not make it entirely aligned. Here we wanted the music of veena or sitar, but here we have the music of an English band. That was because of our constitution makers were educated that way. That is exactly the kind of constitution Mahatma Gandhi did not want and did not envisage. ये बात किसने बोली है? के हनुमान नाथिया ने 17 November 1949 को. Now next is here. First, many Indians have not only adopted modern ways of thinking but have made these their own. For फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल तो मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि मेरे को कक्का आता ही नहीं है, ऑप्शनल का ना किसी और चीज़ का. फर्स्टली आई वुड बी स्टडिंग दीज 11th and 12th वाला पॉलिटिकल साइंस का बुक NCERT. फिर उसके बाद मेरे पास इग्नू की मास्टर्स की दोनों ईयर्स की जो है बुक है, MA फर्स्ट ईयर और MA सेकेंड ईयर की. फिर उसके बाद मेरा भाई भी BA ऑनर्स इन पॉलिटिकल साइंस इग्नू से ही परस्यू कर रहा है, तो उसकी भी बुक होंगी BA फर्स्ट ईयर की, सेकेंड ईयर की एंड थर्ड ईयर की. आई थिंक दिस वुड बी द मोर देन इनफ सोर्स. और फिर उसके बाद जो है जो प्रीवियस ईयर वाला क्वेश्चंस होता है PSIR का, वो सारे के सारे मैं अटैम्प्ट करके मतलब प्रैक्टिस कर लूँगी. मुझे नहीं लगता कि इसके अलावा भी कुछ और रह गया. और फिर मैं डेली जो है वो न्यूज़ देखती हूँ, द हिंदू चैनल जो है. और अगर हमें इंडिया वाला देखना है तो फिर इंडिया वाले में है संसद TV, और एक ऑल इंडिया रेडियो करके भी कुछ है. तो जितने भी नेशनल इंटरनेशनल न्यूज़ हैं उनके साथ मैं अप टू डेट रहती हूँ. तो और क्या ही पढ़ूँगी मैं, बस हो गया डन. किसी उथर वुथर की बुक तो मैं पढ़ने वाली नहीं हूँ. इधर जो क्या बातें हैं इधर है, फर्स्ट मैनी इंडियंस हैव नॉट ओनली अडोप्टेड मॉडर्न वेज ऑफ thinking but have made their own. For them westernization became a form of protest against the filth in their own tradition. Ram Mohan Roy started this trend and it is continued to this day by Dalits. Indeed, as early as 1841 it was noticed that the Dalit people of northern India were not afraid to use the newly introduced legal system and bring suits against their landlords. So this new instruments of modern law was effectively adopted by the people to address the questions of dignity and justice. Second, when the Western modernity began to interact with local cultural systems, something like a hybrid culture began to emerge, possibly by creative adaptation for which a parallel can be found neither in the Western modernity. पॉलिटिकल साइंस तो एक ऐसा प्यारा सा सब्जेक्ट है जो कि साइंस वाला स्ट्रीम का भी बच्चा हो या फिर कोई किसी भी प्रोफेशन में हो, फिर भी पॉलिटिक्स में इंटरेस्ट तो रखता ही है. पॉलिटिकल डिस्कशन तो सभी करते हैं, ये इतना सुंदर सा सब्जेक्ट है. लेकिन दिक्कत तो उस चीज़ की है ना कि वो इतनी सारी हिस्ट्री जो चीज़ हुई है, अब हमें चोला पल्लव पांड्या पता नहीं किन किन से क्या ही लेना देना, और उनको जो है रटना, उनका सीक्वेंस याद करना कि कौन कब क्या कैसे आया था, किसने क्या करा था, दैट इज़ वेरी वेरी डिफ़िकल्ट थिंग. ये तो फिर भी रिलेटेबल है. अब जैसे हम पढ़ रहे हैं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, तो कल 26 जनवरी आ रहा है, रिपब्लिक डे है. सारी की सारी चीज़ें बहुत ज़्यादा मतलब सराउंडिंग्स में दिखती हैं, सुनी जाती हैं, लेकिन जो हम चोल पांडा नहीं जाते. सेकेंड जो था वो है व्हेन वेस्टर्न मॉडर्निटी बिगेन टू इंटरेक्ट विद द लोकल कल्चरल सिस्टम, समथिंग लाइक अ हाइब्रिड कल्चर बिगेन टू इमर्ज, possibly by creative adaptation for which a parallel can be found neither in the Western modernity nor in the indigenous traditions. This cluster of newly developed phenomenon forced out of Western modern and indigenous traditional cultural systems have the character of a different alternative modernity. In the non-Western societies, different modernities emerged as non-Western societies try to break loose not only from their own past practice but also from the shackles of a particular version of Western modernity imposed on them. Thus, when we were drafting our constitution, efforts were made to amalgamate Western and traditional Indian values. It was a process of selective adaptation and not the borrowing. Now, next is the limitations. All this is not to say that the Constitution of India is a perfect and flawless document. Given the social conditions within which the constitution was made, it was only natural that there may be many controversial matters, that there would be many areas that needed careful revision. There are many features of this constitution that have emerged mainly due to the exigencies of the time. Nonetheless, we must admit that there are many limitations on this to this constitution. Let us briefly mention the limitations of the constitution. First, the Indian constitution has a centralized idea of national unity. Second, it appears to have glossed over some important issues of the gender justice, particularly within the family. Third, it is not clear why in a poor developing country certain basic socio-economic rights were relegated to the section on the directive principles rather than made an integral feature of our fundamental rights. It is possible to give answers to these limitations, to explain why this happened or even to overcome them, but that is not our point. We are arguing that these limitations are not serious enough to jeopardize the philosophy of the constitution.